Well, no one in public life now self-humiliates more than Elon Musk. Yes, Donald Trump self-humiliates all the time with most of what comes out of his mouth and, of course, every dance move. But as a politician, Donald Trump is required in that pursuit to speak publicly and to do so frequently. Corporate titans don't have to do that. They are under no obligation to speak. We have no idea what Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, thinks about most things. We have no idea what the head of General Motors or Ford or the people running Google think about most things. But Elon Musk, unwisely, steps out of his intellectual depth every day, repeatedly, to humiliate himself the way I would humiliate myself if I were to talk about electric cars, for example. He humiliates himself talking about subjects he knows absolutely nothing about, like who should be the next majority leader of the United States Senate. Donald Trump didn't say a public word about that. He did not dare. But Elon Musk foolishly did. Elon Musk picked Florida Senator Rick Scott, publicly endorsed him, and Rick Scott came in last among the group of three candidates for majority leader. Everyone knew he was going to come in last. Only two of those candidates were serious candidates, and only one of them actually had a real chance. Senator John Thune of South Dakota won on the first ballot, even though Elon Musk publicly opposed John Thune and announced publicly, and he thought this was really condemning, that John Thune was really the favorite choice of Democrats. And that is actually true. Democrats don't want John Thune to be majority leader. They want Chuck Schumer to stay as majority leader. But if a Republican has to be majority leader, they would prefer John Thune to the alternatives. Elon Musk foolishly believed that identifying that simple fact that Democrats would prefer John Thune would kill John Thune's candidacy for majority leader with Republican senators. But everyone in the Senate already knew that the Democrats preferred John Thune. And so Elon Musk's public humiliation today began in John Thune's office, where next year's Republican majority leader of the Senate politely allowed Elon Musk an audience. Elon Musk apparently loves an audience, which is why he was so eager to get on the stage with Donald Trump and literally jump up and down. And Elon Musk and his Trump-assigned sidekick, Vivek Ramaswamy, got an audience today with Republicans in the House and Senate about their brilliant new ideas that no one else has ever thought of to cut trillions of dollars from the federal budget, something Donald Trump has tricked them into thinking they can do by putting them in charge of a department that does not exist, a department that they are calling the Department of Government Efficiency. Elon Musk got the support of exactly one senator when he announced he wanted to drastically cut defense spending. The one senator who supports drastically cutting defense spending is, of course, not a Republican. He is a senator who has been pushing for drastic cuts in defense spending for his entire career. That senator is Bernie Sanders of Vermont. The only specific cut to defense spending that Elon Musk has offered is that he wants to completely kill the ultra-expensive F-35 fighter plane. However, even Bernie Sanders has a piece of the F-35 action in Vermont with some planes stationed there, and you better not try to cut Bernie Sanders' F-35s in Vermont. Unlike Elon Musk, Bernie Sanders actually has a vote in the United States Senate, but he has not been able to cut defense spending. Elon Musk, who does not have a vote in the Senate or the House, will not be able to stop the F-35 or cut defense spending. The F-35 is one of the most massive defense projects with contracts spread out over dozens of states so that it is guaranteed the support of members of the House and the Senate who have pieces of that contract in their states, as well as the support of champions of defense spending whose states don't even get a penny from the F-35. Only Congress can vote to cut the F-35. And so, as I've said before, Elon Musk is simply another lobbyist in Washington trying to convince Congress to do something that Congress does not want to do. And he's the most ignorant lobbyist Washington's ever seen. The United States has been selling F-35s to other countries, including the United Kingdom, Japan, and Israel, where it is now the most popular flying weapon of war. Saudi Arabia desperately wants to buy F-35s. What do you think Donald Trump's going to do when Elon Musk urges him to support the elimination of the F-35 and Saudi Arabia says to Donald Trump, we want to buy F-35s? The F-35 will be flying high around the world long after Elon Musk's last public humiliation in Washington. Here is how enthusiastic the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was about House Republicans' big meeting today with Elon Musk.
Very productive meeting.
Mr. Speaker, will you cut Medicare?
Listen, I'll just say this is a very productive meeting with Republicans from the Senate and the House today. No, I can't. I'm late for a portrait unveiling.
Very productive meeting. Let me translate. In congressional speak to reporters, very productive meeting is what you say when you have absolutely nothing to say. It certainly is not the language used to convey enthusiasm. That is not full speed ahead language. And I'm late for a portrait unveiling is another way of saying I'm going to run away from this insanity as fast as I can right now. A portrait unveiling. That's the enthusiasm Elon Musk managed to create in the Republican Speaker of the House, who needs to approve any spending cuts that Elon Musk wants the government to do. They all go through Mike Johnson in the House, and they all then have to go through the United States Senate. I mean, I guess it's a sign of respect that the Speaker of the House allowed Elon Musk to make him late for a portrait unveiling. Elon Musk was not leading the only humiliation parade in the halls of Congress today. The Pete Hegseth disgrace tour of Senate offices continued with J.D. Vance nowhere to be seen. On the first day of Senate office tours for Donald Trump's choice for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth had Senator J.D. Vance smiling at his side every step of the way, just like J.D. Vance did so successfully and memorably for Matt Gaetz, way back when Matt Gaetz was Donald Trump's choice for Attorney General. But even J.D. Vance knows when a nomination is dead. And so he handed off the escorting task to one of the most spectacular losers in the history of the United States Senate. J.D. Vance was in Washington today, but he refused to have anything to do with Pete Hegseth. And I don't say Norm Coleman is a loser as an insult. I'm just reporting it as a fact. There's no disgrace in coming in second in an election, as Norm Coleman did in his Senate re-election campaign in 2008. But Norm Coleman has the singular distinction in United States Senate history of being the very first and only United States senator who lost his re-election campaign to a comedian. Republican Norm Coleman was defeated in 2008 in his re-election campaign by Democrat Al Franken. Al Franken went on to serve as a studious and serious and effective United States senator, unlike the forgettable Norm Coleman. Norm Coleman made the standard choice for most senators in the 21st century who lose their re-election campaigns. He became a Washington lobbyist. He now represents Saudi Arabia. And he also represents, this week anyway, Pete Hegseth. He is now Pete Hegseth's official guide on Pete Hegseth's hopeless tour of Senate offices, trying to push his confirmation up to 51 votes in the Senate. There's Norm Coleman, right there with Pete Hegseth. Norm Coleman is not one of those respected former senators who's respected on both sides of the aisle. There are fewer and fewer of those than ever, but Norm Coleman was never going to be the kind of respected Senate veteran who could actually in any way help a troubled nominee get through the confirmation process. Of course, the best possible guide you could have in the Senate as a nominee is an actual current United States senator. And if you're a troubled nominee, an actual current United States senator can be invaluable to your Senate tour. Clarence Thomas is on the Supreme Court tonight largely because he was guided through what became a Senate lobbying campaign by Republican Senator Jack Danforth of Missouri, who was a sitting senator at the time and one of the most respected members of the Senate by both parties. Jack Danforth saved that nomination. Pete Hegseth does not have a Senate savior. In brief comments to reporters today in the hallway of the Senate, Pete Hegseth said that he spoke to Donald Trump on the phone today, and he said, this is what Hegseth said, he's behind us all the way. I don't know what he means by us, but okay. The problem for Pete Hegseth with Donald Trump being on the phone with Pete Hegseth, if that's true, is that Donald Trump was not on the phone at that same time with a Republican senator who needs to be convinced to vote for Pete Hegseth. That is Donald Trump's one and only job today if he's really pushing the Hegseth nomination. And there are multiple reports indicating that Donald Trump is not making a single phone call to any senator for Pete Hegseth, and multiple reports that Donald Trump is considering alternatives to Pete Hegseth. And if that's true, that is a very strong statement that Donald Trump can make to the Senate. It's a strong statement that in effect says to the Senate, Donald Trump's silence in phone calls to the Senate means to them that he will be moving on from Pete Hegseth as soon as he has someone to name as defense secretary who he thinks can be confirmed. Most nominees for Senate confirmation are there because of their experience. Ideally, they bring solid records of achievement that are relevant to the job they are being nominated for, and they stress their personal history and experience to senators in private meetings and in confirmation hearings. They do not bring their spouses with them to those meetings, as Pete Hegseth has been doing, so that he can parade his third marriage as what looks like, on camera anyway, in a hallway, a good marriage. They do not ask their mothers to call senators. They don't do that. The Hill is reporting today that Pete Hegseth told Republicans that his mother is calling senators for him. Donald Trump's not calling senators for him, but he says his mother is calling senators for him. That has never happened in the history of the Senate confirmation process. No mother has ever called. Never. Instead of stressing his personal experience and his history to United States senators and to the public, Pete Hegseth's public case for his confirmation, as he expressed it today, is this.
I'm a different man than I was years ago.
How about the man he was months ago? NBC News reports one of the sources said they smelled alcohol on him as recently as last month and heard him complain about being hungover this fall. Here is the man Pete Hegseth says he no longer is. The New York Times reports at Fox News, the network's Human Resources Department looked into Mr. Hegseth's conduct at the Fox and Friends Christmas party in 2016 and discussed it with him, according to a person with intimate knowledge who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss a personnel matter. The following December, Mr. Hegseth got so drunk at a wedding of a Fox News producer that he struggled to stand upright in a men's bathroom, according to two people with direct knowledge of the episode who declined to be named for fear of retribution. Friends asked a producer who was there to get Mr. Hegseth a ride home so he could make it to the set by 6 a.m., they said. The Secretary of Defense never has to worry about getting a ride home. But the Secretary of Defense has to be sober enough to receive and process some very important, urgent, worldwide important phone calls at any hour of the day or night.
I'm a different man than I was years ago.
Here is that different man. The Washington Post reports at Fox News, Hegseth had a reputation as a heavy drinker, according to 6 former Fox News employees who worked directly with Hegseth and saw him drinking on the job or visibly drunk at work events, and who spoke on the condition of anonymity out of fear of retaliation several years ago during a St. Patrick's Day segment on Fox and Friends Weekend. Support staff at the cable news network set up a display of beers for a holiday segment on the show. After the segment aired, Hegseth walked by the display table and drank each beer, according to 2 former colleagues who witnessed the incident and spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive episode. The incident struck the colleagues as jarring for 2 reasons. 1, the displayed drinks had been sitting out for hours and were stale and warm. 2, the show wraps up at 10 a.m., an early hour for alcohol consumption. Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearing defense was, I didn't do any of the things I'm accused of doing. Pete Hegseth's defense is, I'm a different man than I was years ago. That line of defense has never been tried before in a Senate confirmation hearing, not once. If Republican senators accept that line of defense, they will be the first senators in history in the confirmation process to accept the changed man defense. You'll be hearing a version of that changed man defense from Robert Kennedy Jr. if he makes it all the way to a confirmation hearing for Secretary of Health and Human Services, the most unqualified nominee in the history of that position. When Robert Kennedy Jr.'s criminal possession of heroin comes up and his heroin addiction comes up, he will say, I'm a different man than I was years ago. When his abuse of women comes up, he will say, I'm a different man than I was years ago. Elon Musk, too, appears to be a different man than he was years ago, when he apparently did a reasonably good job of helping increase the sales of an electric car company after investing in that pre-existing company that he did not create. He didn't know anything about electric cars or car production until he invested in that company. But he's going to find that adapting to that manufacturing process was a lot easier than trying to shape federal government spending according to his whim. A senior Republican aide gave Punchbowl News the inside view of congressional Republicans' attitude toward Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's so-called Department of Government Efficiency. Quote, 2 people who know nothing about how the government works, pretending they can cut $1 trillion, both with decent pulpits to preach from and the ear of an unpredictable president? Disaster. The only good thing is that at some point they'll overpromise and get bounced by Trump. But until then, disaster.